Welcome to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy. We are about to start on a three-part series that requires a bit of a special introduction. I first want to always say the usual things. For those who are new here, please consider going back and listening to these episodes from the beginning to understand the scriptural case that we make about polygamy and then the historical case we've been making more recently. And I also, as always, have to thank those who have donated to this podcast. I cannot tell you how helpful it is and how much it means to me. And I still could use more support. So if anyone feels inclined, please feel free to contribute to this podcast as well. And now on to the description of this episode. So I have to say I'm deep into the research on the Nauvoo Expositor. That's what I've been working on, getting ready for the fourth part on that series. And I just hit a wall. I just was blocked, complete stupor of thought every time I went to sit down to my computer. So finally, one day when I feel the urgency and the burden of this and I have to get it done. So I went on my run and about 4 different people had sent me this video on, well, I'm just going to throw the topic out there on what's called SRA, satanic ritual abuse is what the topic of the video was talking about, specifically in Utah. And so I thought, well, if this many people have sent it to me, I better listen to it. So as I went on my run, I listened to it. And as I was listening to it, horrified, trying to decide whether or not I should believe it. But the more I listened, the more it seemed like I needed to believe it because the evidence seemed somewhat solid enough to at least be taken seriously. And anyway, a series of scriptures started going through my mind. And I just paused and asked, Lord, is this what you want me to do right now? I've kind of found that if I have a stupor of thought like that, there's usually a different direction I need to go, or there's some reason for it rather than just pushing through it. That doesn't seem to usually be the solution. So I felt very strongly that I needed to go this direction, which I didn't fully understand other than one of my basic working principles is if there were fewer enablers, there would be less abuse. So if me using my voice could help minimize this problem in any way, then I was willing. But I did some work and was able to immediately contact the people that I needed to set up interviews. And as I got into this deeper and deeper, I realized that this actually isn't a completely separate issue. There are relations and connections that I had not even known to think about or consider. And so I think that these are things that we need to be aware of. I think that we need to consider what information there is before we just make a knee-jerk reaction about them. So that is what we're going to go into. I'm hoping that I've already released my temple episode. Those of you who have been asking for it, thank you for being patient. I'm sorry that I thought I had to finish up those other topics before I pivoted to the temple. I've heard you and I've been working feverishly to get ready for the episode on the temple. I'm hoping, I'm recording this Wednesday night. I'm hoping to release the temple episode on Sunday, if at all possible. If not, you're getting this episode instead, but I will do the temple episode next week, then come back to the rest of the episodes in this series. So one way or the other, it's going to come quickly. But I have to just give a little bit of explanation. So this interview that I'm releasing today is actually not the first interview I recorded on this topic. It's the second one, but I thought it would be a better one to release first to kind of set the stage, help people understand what we're going to talk about. It's also a much more gentle episode. I don't think I need any trigger warnings or anything to worry about in this episode. I had the opportunity to speak with Spencer Cannon, who works at the Utah County Sheriff's Department. He is the media relations sergeant there. A great guy. So I'm really excited to bring you this episode. In the part 2, I will release my episode with Goel. Some of you may recognize his name who have been following this. Some of you may not. He put together a special presentation kind of showing the connections between the investigations he's been doing on this satanic ritual abuse and some ways that it connects with polygamy that are really troubling to me. And then in the third part, I will release an interview with someone who grew up being a victim of ritualistic abuse. And so my hope is that we can hear these things in the spirit they are intended to be shared. I have so many thoughts going back and forth. I'll give give some of the scriptures that I've been thinking of in the introductions of other episodes. But this episode today, I hope that you will listen to with an open heart and an open mind. I thought it was actually excellent. I was able to talk to the Sheriff's Department about things like prosecuting crimes that happen in polygamy and how that can be better facilitated and how is the best way to approach it, as well as many other topics with one of the greatest guys I know. So anyway, I'm so glad that you are here. I hope that you enjoy this episode and are able to learn from it as I speak with my good friend, Spencer Cannon. Welcome to 132 Problems. I am so happy to be here with my good friend, one of the best guys I know. This is Spencer Cannon, and he actually is the Public Information Officer for the Utah County Sheriff's Office, where he's a sergeant. He's been with the Sheriff's Department for 33 years, and he's been serving in the role of the Public Information Officer for 20 years. So he has a lot of experience talking to the press, talking about these kinds of issues, sharing his insights and wisdom and things. But more importantly, to me, Spencer and I share grandbabies. Spencer's awesome daughter I get to claim as my daughter-in-law, and she is a gem, and the Cannons are gems. And so it's really fun to do this semi-official, semi-personal discussion.
Yeah.
And Spencer, I want to thank you so much for coming and talking to me.
Well, I'm glad to be here with you, and I hope that I have something to offer. And having a connection with the Stone family is one of the best things in our life. So.
Oh, see, this is what he's the best. Okay. So Spencer, did I miss anything in your introduction? I know quite a bit about your family. You have 5 kids, I believe. We got your youngest.
Yeah, five children and 10 grandchildren, and we love every one of them.
Awesome.
And the ones that have married into the family too.
Excellent. Well, my gosh, we feel so lucky that we feel so blessed that my son gets you guys for in-laws. We could not have done better. So,
we feel very much the same.
Thank you. And so I believe you served in the Army. I know you've just had a life in sort of peacekeeping, I guess we could say, right? So a lot of experience with all of these issues we're going to discuess.
Yeah,
You've probably seen a broad spectrum of things.
Yeah, I spent 4 years on active duty and 4 years in the National Guard, and actually a year in the Reserve and 3 in the National Guard, and lived up there not far from where you guys are in American Fork for 28 years, and moved a few years ago up into Spanish Fork Canyon, but just loving it.
That's great. Okay. Well, so the reason I wanted to have Spencer come on is because I'm going to start delving. I just have felt like I'm supposed to start going into some issues that are a little bit of a stretch for me, things that I needed to get caught up on a little bit. Specifically, I guess we should just say it, some of the horrible abuse cases that have been in the press and in the news and in Spencer's department with Mike Smith, the Sheriff's Department. So specifically things with David Leavitt, the Hamblin affidavit. So what we're talking about is what's known as SRA, or satanic ritual abuse. And I just did an interview last night with a guy who goes by the pseudonym Goel. I'll be releasing that one as well, who has been investigating this intensely for the last 14 years, trying to get the information to help the Sheriff's Department be able to prosecute it. From what I understand, it's hard to prosecute this stuff. You guys are limited on time, on means, on money, on personnel, and it's hard to chase everything down in these difficult cases. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's some reality to that. Some things that are especially challenging, and there's a couple of different areas. And you mentioned satanic ritual abuse, and we recognize that does go on. Not all of it is necessarily satanic in nature. Some of it does have a religious aspect to it, and that may be satanic, or it may be Christianized in some way through some sort of formal religious structure. But in the ones that we deal with that are like this, one of the big problems is that typically the cases are so old, and we're not talking just a few years, we're talking decades old. And it used to be that Utah's law had a statute of limitations where you either had to initiate a prosecution within 4 years of the time it was reported or 8 years from the time that the abuse occurred. That changed a number of years ago, so there is no statute of limitation on those things now. And so if somebody was abused many years ago, then those cases can still be prosecuted. But the probably one of the biggest a number of problems that we encounter when investigating those, not the least of which is memories. How well and how accurately does somebody remember something? The likelihood, for example, of getting physical evidence. If somebody calls and reports abuse that they say happened yesterday, and it was horribly painful and created injuries and things, then there will be physical evidence to support the allegation. Not likely that we're going to have that in a case that may be 20 or 30 or more years old. And so you're relying on the disclosure from a victim. You also may be relying on disclosure that the victim made to other people, maybe a parent, maybe a teacher, maybe a therapist, or maybe even to law enforcement, that for whatever reason wasn't followed up on or wasn't investigated adequately. And so then we are now in a position where we need to go back and try to confirm with others in some way, besides, and not that we can't move forward on a case with only an allegation or a disclosure from a victim, but it makes a case stronger if we have information that we can corroborate that comes from either other victims or people that somebody disclosed to when they were, say, a child, either a teenager or a young single digits aged person. And so it can be complicated that way. But memory is a real problem as well, and how somebody remembers things. It doesn't mean that it can't be prosecuted or investigated and prosecuted, but it does make it more challenging.
Okay, that all makes sense. So if you have the physical evidence, obviously that's the strongest case. And your job, you don't prosecute the crimes. Your job is to get the evidence together so that the prosecutors can choose to prosecute it and can do so successfully.
Yeah, that's
right?
correct. We do interviews. We take disclosures from victims. We talk to witnesses that they tell us about. We try to get as much information to confirm what they tell us happened to them, and then we put that all together, hopefully in a coherent and clear manner, so that when we submit a case to the prosecutors, they can then follow through and file criminal charges with the courts.
Okay, I have so many questions. So, a couple of different directions I want to go. So I brought up the big ritual abuse topic, which you weren't in your position in the 80s when
No.
these things started being reported and it became the satanic panic. So to me, that has kind of, poisoned the well, so that when people hear, oh, ritual abuse, all of a sudden we just think crazy town. So can you kind of speak to I'm kind of serious. Do these things happen? Should people believe that these things happen? Did they happen in the 80s and that was a way to cover it up? I'm sure that there are also sort of unstable people making, fallacious reports. So I'm sure it all gets messy, but how should we think about this just as citizens?
It's difficult to look at, and I understand why people may have the inclination to say, "Oh, that doesn't happen." There was a national news organization after we had some information that we put out a year and a half or so ago that wrote a very long article, basically saying that we were among those being caught up in the satanic panic. What I find interesting is that if we take a report, a disclosure from, say, a 6-year-old child who discloses just horrible, unthinkable sexual abuse, and maybe they own a small business, or maybe they're a school teacher, or maybe they're a sports coach of some kind, or maybe they're just a next door neighbor, or something like that. Maybe they're a religious leader of some kind. It's horrible, it's reprehensible, and when we think about it, it just makes us sick to our stomachs. But we don't have a hard time believing what this child is telling us, and especially if it's supported with forensic evidence, physical evidence that they tell us this, and we find evidence on the child to support what they said. But the second we throw ritualistic in front of that, suddenly it's not believable. It couldn't happen. It can't be real. Well, it can be real, and it is real, and it does happen. It may not be as common as, God, I hate to even say, run of the mill sexual abuse.
Standard abuse.
There's nothing
Yeah,
run of the
yeah.
mill about it. It's
Hmm.
horribly violating to those victims, um, but it can happen in a way that is even more secretive, that may involve multiple parties, that may involve rituals that are either specifically religious in nature or just uh, rituals that are consistent in the way the abuse is carried out, in the way that the threats are made, and those kinds of things that make it seem like it's less real. And so when we have horrible abuse, which I can tell you horrible abuse happens, and when we release information about somebody we've arrested and abuse that they perpetrated, people don't have a hard time believing it. They don't want to believe it's true, but they know it is. Yet when we throw the word ritualistic in there, suddenly, we're getting caught up in the hype, and it's not real. Well, I'm here to tell you that it is real, and it does happen. And while we might not investigate those kinds of cases as often, they are real and they do happen.
Okay. Okay. I really appreciate that. I think that's such a good wake up call for all of us to hear. I think that's important. When you say you don't investigate them as often, does that mean they don't come in front of you as often? That you don't see them as often, or that you choose to investigate them less often?
And I don't know the statistical numbers on that. I know that we don't see as many of them that are characterized that way, but whether that means that they don't happen as often or they just don't get reported as often, I don't know. It may be a little bit of both, but sexual abuse is something that has for decades, and I think it's changing for the better now. Uh, that a child will come and they'll report something, or there will be signs that should be fairly easy for an adult or a trusted loved one or a teacher or a trusted adult, to see, but you don't want to believe it's true, or it gets reported and maybe it's a neighbor that everybody likes, and you don't want them to get in trouble and say, well, we'll just handle this ourselves. And that is absolutely the wrong approach to take. I think we're getting better at that in this generation socially that we're in, but it's still a problem. I mean, there is still the reality that many people don't want to talk about it, don't want to get the problem addressed, don't want to get somebody arrested because they don't want someone's life to fall apart. But my response is, what about the life of that victim who has been abused? Are we going to let somebody else's life carry on, uh, pretending to be normal, while their life might be falling apart and their future may be mapped out for them already because of the challenges they're going to face emotionally because of the physical and sexual abuse that they may have been a part of or been a victim of?
Okay, I'm so glad you said that. That is just like so music to my ears. I have a sister actually who had that experience, who was abused by an older man who served in high callings. And it's so hard for these victims to grow to the point of getting over the shame, realizing it wasn't their fault, and then going and finally reporting. And she reported to three separate bishops who each said, "Oh, God can help you forgive. That was a long time ago. We don't want to ruin this good man's life. Think of his wife." And that it's so, I mean, that was a couple of decades ago that happened, but it's so destructive for a victim to finally come forward and either not be believed because it's ritualistic or whatever it is, or not be prioritized.
Yeah.
Is I feel like it re-victimizes people.
Oh, it really
And
does. It really does. I mean, imagine this, and imagine we may get to this, but I'll bring it up now. on May 31st last year, we put out a press release regarding ritualistic child sexual abuse. And that's exactly how it was described. And the reason we did it, there was no matter of timing. It was just that it was getting to the point where we realized that this was a broader problem than what the original case that we started investigating in April of 2021 we would have thought it was. And it takes all these little side roads, which is normal in any criminal investigation. But it got to the point where we thought we realized there were probably other victims out there, and we wanted to give them an opportunity to feel safe in coming forward. So we did that press release. And we said, if there is anybody who has experienced this kind of abuse and would like to talk to us, we will listen to you, we will believe you, and we will conduct investigations. And as a result of that, we had over 150 people call in. A few of them were somebody reporting it second party, that somebody else had been abused.
Secondhand.
Or a therapist, for example, calling in and saying, I can help with this if you need help. But the majority of those 150 plus calls were people who were themselves victims. And so we took every one of them. We found out the best that we could what happened and where it happened. And many of those, when we put out that press release, we were focusing on an area involving Provo and the southern part of Utah County, Sanpete County, and Juab County. And what we found is that of these 150 people, while a few of those were in that area that I described, there were many who were outside of that area here in Utah, and even many that were outside the state of Utah. So we made referrals to agencies that had jurisdiction over those cases. And, some of these people had never reported it before or never told anybody about it, either law enforcement or a loved one or a family member or anything. And some of them had told a loved one or a family member or a teacher in some cases, and it just hadn't been taken seriously and it was never reported. So they lived with that, they repressed that and put it down, and they did what they could to get through life, knowing what they had experienced, but also knowing that those that they were supposed to be able to trust couldn't or didn't know how. Either they didn't know how, or they were afraid to say anything, or they didn't want anybody to get in trouble. And so we said, we will listen to you. We will talk to you. We will take anything you tell us seriously. And we couldn't promise that every one of those cases will work through to a prosecution, because with the issue of time and everything, that is problematic in some ways. And there would be some of those cases where you're not going to be able to get the evidence so that it's strong enough to be able to submit a case for prosecution. And that's sad for them, but at least they came to us knowing that we were going to take them seriously and we were going to believe them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't mean that if we're going to ignore information that tells us that what they're saying is not true. And I don't know if that happened in any of these cases. I wasn't directly part of the investigations, but that sometimes does happen. But at the start of their disclosure to us, we are taking them seriously. We are believing what they tell us, and we are following through in the best way we can, either by investigating it ourselves with the task force that we had set up, or referring it to the proper jurisdictional agency.
Okay, that is wonderful to hear. I'm so glad. And I think that's probably so helpful to people. I guess I'm always just wanting to say that if any victims are listening, Spencer's a great guy. Like, reach out to this department. You couldn't be in better hands. And along those lines, I'm going to ask a question that I hope is okay. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but there are some challenges sometimes, like I mentioned about my sister's experience. And so the church, I think that we still struggle on this issue a little bit and haven't always managed it the best. We don't seem to be the best at prioritizing victims, knowing how to respond, providing training, and prioritizing victims. And so I don't know if you want to kind of say anything about that. I know that we now have the sex abuse hotline, and anyway, if you can share anything along those lines, that would be.
I'm LDS. For those of your listeners who don't know, I am LDS. I'm also a cop, but I believe strongly in both sides of that. And I believe that from my perspective personally, my goal in both of those is the same, and that is to bring justice for victims, and even to get help for perpetrators, because they still need an opportunity to change the way they think, the way they act, and everything. But our primary focus is helping victims. So what happens sometimes, there's no doubt that there has been blatant cover up by various religious organizations over the years, and I won't name any. I will mention one, but I resolved the problem. I had a case of when I was working as a detective many years ago. I had a case of child sexual abuse that happened between two neighbors. They were young teenagers. One was a teenager, one was single digit age. The victim was, and but the abuse occurred outside of the city boundary where they lived, so it became our case. And the leader of that LDS congregation, he gave the guidance to the parents of both people involved, the young perpetrator and the younger victim, that they shouldn't talk to police. And that is, I know that that's not the counsel and the guidance from the church, and I know legally that's not the case. Now, the only situation where a clergyman or clergy person in Utah does not have to disclose is if a perpetrator comes to them and confesses, and they will not, at the encouragement of that clergy, go to the police, then the clergy, by most religious guidance, should not report it, at least in Utah. In Utah, clergy are not required to be mandatory reporters. So anyway, in this particular case, I called that LDS bishop, and I told him that you can give what counsel you want to the perpetrator here, because I can't tell you what to do with his parents. I would like to talk to him as well. But as for the victim, if I don't hear from them within 2 hours about scheduling an appointment to come and have their child interviewed by me, then I will come to your house and arrest you. So I threatened to arrest an LDS bishop. And within about 45 minutes or an hour, I got a call from both families. And I was mad that he was doing this, because I thought it was not treating the victim well. I thought that victim needed justice. I thought by covering up in some, what I thought was a misguided effort to protect the child and look out for that child's welfare, I thought that, legally the bishop was wrong. He was required by church handbook guidance and by Utah state statute to contact police, because he got it from a third party, so he was not protected by the confessional. He did not get it from the perpetrator, the teenage perpetrator, so he was obligated by law. And so he did. He ended up doing the right thing, but sometimes I think many of us have that feeling we don't want to mess up somebody's life. But what we don't think about is, while their life might be messed up right now, one, it's of their own doing, and two, if we don't mess up their life now, which it isn't messing up their life, then what's going to happen to them 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road? If we get to their life and we have an intervention, then maybe they have a chance to stop the behavior and never do it again. But if we don't, maybe they will continue, and other people, other victims will suffer because of our own inaction.
Okay. So wishful thinking and just wanting it to go away is not the answer.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm the leader of our branch up in where we live, up Spanish Fork Canyon, and I told as I was having the discussion, as the call was being extended, I said, I know what the handbook says about calling the abuse helpline, and I said, I'll be glad to call the abuse helpline, but it will be after I call the police and report it. I think they have the order mixed up. I think that the very first thing that helps the child the most is to get help on the way immediately. And I'm not talking just about the police, because we aren't the ones that can provide the treatment and the therapy and the services that they need. We can help facilitate those, but our job is to gather evidence. And in cases like this, we gather evidence by way of interviews. We have specialists who do physical exams. We don't do those ourselves. We sometimes aren't even the ones that do the interviews. Sometimes we have Child Protective Services officials who do those interviews. The primary thing that we need to do is get those services rolling,
Mhm.
and then I'll call and I'll get advice from the helpline. And I know what the advice is going to be, but it's not going to be in the order that they want it to be.
Okay, so what's the advice going to be?
The advice is going to be that to do what you're legally obligated to. Now, in
Okay.
Utah, not all states allow for the confidentiality of the confessional. So if a perpetrator comes to a religious leader of any church in some states, then they confess something, then by law those clergy members are required to report it. In Utah and some other states, that is not the case. Utah allows that if somebody comes to a religious leader, whether it's a bishop or a priest or a pastor or whomever, and confesses something, and in this case we're talking about child sexual abuse, if they come and they confess that, but that religious leader has not heard it from any other source, and despite their encouraging, that person is unwilling to turn themselves in to the police or turn themselves over to law enforcement, then the clergy member is bound by the confessional and cannot disclose. And that's
Okay.
usually by the guidance of the policies of the religious organization. I don't know if there are religious organizations in Utah that ignore that and say, I don't care what state law allows, you will, if you're going to be clergy for our organization, you will report it. The LDS Church is not one of those. The LDS Church does go by the confessional. If somebody comes and confesses, then they're not required by church policy to report it, despite what the law says.
So, okay, I want to pause on that for a minute, if that's okay. So, to clarify, it's not only that they're not required to; it's that they're legally not allowed to report.
I don't think there's a legal prohibition from doing it if
Okay.
it's church policy. Um, but
So the church could encourage its leaders to still report to police.
no, they don't.
It,
They do
I mean,
not.
they could do that
Well,
without
a
breaking
church
the law,
could
like that.
certainly. A church can set
The
whatever
church could.
policies they want administratively. That has nothing to do with doctrine. That has everything to do with the administrative side of how any church is operated. And I assume that they could choose to have their policy be that despite what state law allows, we do want you to report it.
Right.
It's like if a perpetrator goes for counseling to a therapist, a mental health therapist is a mandatory reporter in the state of Utah. A doctor is a mandatory reporter. School teachers are mandatory reporters. So if a perpetrator wants to bare their soul to a therapist and get some help, thinking that they are going to be protected by disclosing the abuse they have perpetrated to a mental health provider, then they're wrong, because a mental health services provider is required to report that. And I think a lot of them, they give that disclaimer before they start that, certain things, if you disclose, I'm a mandatory reporter, blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
But clergy don't, they're in Utah, are not among those who are considered mandatory reporters.
Are you allowed, as both a leader of your congregation, so a member of the clergy, and as a sheriff, are you allowed to share your opinion on that? Because I have some, I mean, I think on the one hand, I can see like maybe the hope is that people will be willing to talk to someone, but I am so troubled by that because I feel like they're they're needing to unburden their soul, so they're getting the benefit but without any of the due steps to true repentance, without any help for the victims, without any, like, it just seems like a lose-lose to me. I can't see a good side of that.
I think I'm inclined to agree with that. I don't see any value in allowing somebody to not disclose something so horrible that has happened to a person. There's an interesting thing. Many years ago, when I first started in law enforcement, I was working in the jail. I was a corrections deputy working in the Utah County Jail. When I was in the Corrections Academy, they brought over some prisoners who were sex offenders, and we got to ask them some questions and things like that. And they had a licensed clinical social worker who talked to us after they left. And one of the things that, in order for them to heal and everything, and get them to disclose what they've done, because so many of them, they get caught for what they're in prison for, but very often, not with all of them, but with many of them, they have perpetrated other things that they never got caught for. So they encourage them to disclose those things, and as an inducement for them to be willing to disclose, they make a commitment that they will not prosecute them. I did not like that idea. I think, if they have done it, because for me, you do the right thing because it's right, not for fear of the consequences of doing wrong. And if you really want to clean your soul and you're in prison, you should still step up and say, you know what, I'm here for 5 to 15 years or whatever, or 5 to life, or whatever your sentence is. The right thing to do would be to step forward and own up to everything you've done. But they didn't see it that way. I didn't like that idea. So I think that there shouldn't be any people exempted from having to report, when the only source you have for the of the knowledge of the abuse is from the perpetrator themselves. And I think that shouldn't be allowed. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, well, I strongly
If I recall right, there was a bill in the Utah legislature, I think last year, that was discussing doing that. I don't think it didn't get any traction, but it was there, if I remember right, because I remember hearing about it on the news. And I don't know if it ever even got into committee or out of committee or however that all works. I'm not a politician, but I know that there was a bill, but it just never went anywhere.
Okay, so people do see it this way too. I mean, yeah, it's hard for me to see how. I know that if you want to actually, if we use the word like repent, cleanse your soul, like really overcome the horrors of your past, you can't minimize. You can't only admit the tiny bit you need to because you got caught on it, right?
Yeah.
And it seems like
that is reality.
Yeah, and it seems like saying, hey, you won't have any consequences if you clean your soul. It's like, well, that's not really, that's just going, oh, good, okay, I can clean my soul and not, it's not going to work. That's not real. It's not.
Well, it is.
There's always a consequence.
I agree. It's a tough thing, but in reality, too, legally speaking, and I'm not an attorney, but this has just been my experience in what I see. If we have a case where we have, say, 30 counts of any crime, but since we're talking about child sexual abuse, we'll talk about that. If we have a suspect or a defendant who we have investigated and we believe we have enough evidence to support submitting a case for prosecution that includes 30 violations, reality is, when that case gets filed in court, it's probably not going to be 30 charges. It's probably going to be 5 to 10, maybe.
Okay.
And some of those may be reduced down. And you know what? It gets to a point, it's the old, it does you no good to beat a dead horse. It kind of gets to that point where you have 5 charges or you have 30 charges. And if they're all first-degree felonies or even all second-degree felonies, if a judge were to sentence them and they were to run them consecutively, then if you have a second-degree felony that is 5 or 1 to 15 years in prison, and they run those consecutively, they have 5 of them, they're going to be in prison for 75 years. If they have first-degree felonies, it's going to be 5, 10, or 15 years to life in prison. And if they have 2 of those and the judge runs those consecutively, they may be in prison for as much as 30 years before they're even eligible for parole. So what good is it going to do to throw another 25 charges on top of that? So that's the reality of what I usually see in any kind of case, whether it's burglaries or thefts or child sex abuse, where there are tens or dozens of potential charges. We cut it down to those that we can prove much more easily and make it easier to understand if it goes in front of a jury as well.
Okay. Okay. So I have a couple other questions, but I want to pivot to talk a little bit about the Hamblin case, the David Leavitt case,
Okay.
if that's all right, because that's what
Yeah.
really brought this out recently, it seems to me. First, can I just ask you, both in your capacity, I, of course, no specifics, but in your capacity as a sheriff and also as a congregational leader, how big of a problem is child sex abuse in general and ritual abuse specifically? Is this something you have dealt with much?
In my personal capacity, no, I haven't dealt with it at all. In
Thankfully.
my
Okay,
professional
good.
capacity, I've seen it a lot. I didn't spend a long time as a detective, about a year and a half, but as a deputy and as a public information officer, I have either done some initial investigations on it. For the short time that I was a detective, I did some full investigations on it. And now I just do press releases and talk to media about them when they happen. But they're real. The ritualistic side of things we don't see as much of. And ritualistic is not a criminal charge. Ritualistic is just a description of the circumstances. There's no state code that says this is forcible sexual abuse and this is ritualistic forcible sexual abuse. It's forcible sexual abuse, and it's the nature of the circumstances that describes how the abuse happened more than it does the statutory elements that were met in
Sure.
the perpetration of that abuse.
Okay, that makes sense. Just a description.
Right.
From what I've seen so far, and I have not been following this very closely. Your daughter kept me updated on it a bit. She likes to follow it, but
Yeah.
it seems to me that when you put that ritualistic word, it sometimes is much more extreme and much more severe. I mean, I haven't seen I luckily am not in a job where I have to read this stuff regularly, but it seems to me like sometimes when it is ritualistic, it's more horrific. Because there's this additional element of evil.
Yeah, it
can
can be. I think probably more often than anything, rather than the abuse itself being physically more harmful, is the nature of the circumstances where the trust is broken in an even more tragic way. So, for example, if
Okay.
I even hate to talk about degrees of sin, but there are degrees of sin. There are degrees of badness in how something happens. If you've got a teenage neighbor kid, he knows it's wrong. He does it anyway, and it can be awful. It can be physically damaging. But when it's done in a broader context and maybe over time more often, or the things that are done to establish a sense of control and domination that might make it ritualistic, make it more tragic. The act itself,
And the number of people involved and
maybe, yeah, it could be the
yeah,
number of people
okay.
involved. I mean, ritualistic doesn't have to be a group. It could be one person, but it could also be a group. But when you get more people involved, and especially if it goes on over time, then the tragedy deepens. The tragic nature of what's happening to those victims deepens even more, because very often it will be happening at the hands of those who should be providing the ultimate protection that child needs any moment in their life, but especially in that moment of their life.
Okay. And so my understanding is that there's almost a goal to create disassociation. Is that something you've seen? And maybe you're the wrong person to ask about this, but that it's like it has some kind of a almost psychological motivation to make the children sort of break create a
Well,
psychic break, which then can lead to them not remembering. Is that an accurate
well,
thing? The memories come up later.
to some extent, that happens in anything. When somebody perpetrates
Okay.
this kind of a crime, uh, people who do bad things, they don't want to get caught, and so they may say something directly or something in an implied way to make sure that their victims don't tell anybody, or they
Threaten
may,
them.
yeah, they may get them in a, yeah, threaten them, or they may uh, tell them in a way that what's happening is normal and it's okay and it's part of growing up. So, and if you get a child young enough, they may legitimately believe that this really is
Okay.
normal. They feel and they recognize that this isn't fun for them, but this is what growing up is. And if you start them at that age young enough, that's what they believe, and that's part of what is so tragic about this is that the people who should be protecting them and who they should be able to trust implicitly are the ones who are doing this and to them and trying to convince them. They're creating a counterfeit sense of normal life for these children as they're younger that it takes them years and maybe even decades to overcome and even to come to realize that, wait a minute, that wasn't right. And but even when you recognize that something wasn't right, you still have to overcome the patterns of thinking about it so that you can reestablish normal patterns, because the normal patterns that you and I and most people are taught when they're young, they get ingrained in us. And if you haven't had those, if what you've been taught has been abnormal, then it takes a while to break those patterns and establish new ways of realizing and protecting yourself and what's good and what's right and what's not.
Okay. Okay. So somebody, because that's part of the way to throw out victims, especially the satanic panic thing, is that often people remember later. They've maybe attempted suicide dozens of times, and they're a mess, and then they start remembering some of these things. That shouldn't necessarily be a reason to not believe them, to invalidate.
Oh,
Is
yeah,
that
no,
correct?
I mean, and
Okay.
one of the reasons there's two reasons I think why we say you tell us and we'll believe you is we start believing. We start by believing.
Okay.
If something comes up during the course of an investigation that tells us either one, they have embellished this a little bit. Even if they've embellished it, doesn't mean that the original
It's
act
not
didn't
true.
happen. The original abuse didn't happen, but maybe they embellished in a way that made it safer for them to live with it. And so we work our way through those things, but we start by believing them. And if something turns out not to be as accurate, either by intention or by disillusionment or by accident, then we work our way through those things. Um,
Okay.
and we hope that we can do that in a way that's healthy for them. And when I say we, I'm talking a whole group of people. It's not just us as cops and detectives. It's the people we work with, the child services specialists, the children's justice centers, the judges, the prosecutors, the therapists, the child protective services workers, child and family services and things. It's really done as a whole team effort in an attempt to get these people, and they may still be children or they may be adults by now, back to a sense where they can feel comfortable just being with other people and living in their own skin even,
Absolutely. Yeah.
because
Okay. That's
because
really
some
good
of
to
that
know.
some of that might be a sense of shame because they may have been taught that even that this is a punishment on their because of their own behaviors.
It's their fault. And yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
That's some of the ideas I understand it is that even baby girls are seductresses. So it's always their fault because they
Yeah.
turned the guy on. They were asking for it. So to even just be comfortable in
It
your
just
skin.
it makes me sick to even think of those things. But I've seen cases that we've had where perpetrators described a 12-year-old girl as seducing a 30-year-old man, and it really makes me sick to my stomach to think that they could even say that and have any and mean it. It's just
Hmm.
it's not okay.
It's horrific.
It's not ever
Okay.
okay.
Okay. That's great. So, okay. Can you kind of back up and just tell me your experience with this Hamblin the Hamblin
Yeah.
affidavits? What is your experience with those? Give us the background.
Yeah. So there was a case that, and I can't speak to this part of it, but Provo Police Department had a case that was reported to them that involved David Hamlin as a suspect about 10 or 12 years ago. I don't know the exact year, maybe
Okay.
2012 or 2011, something like that. When we had a victim come to us in April of 2021, we knew nothing about this other case that Provo had that involved David Hamlin. But
Can
as
I
well,
ask, is that normal?
that's
Is that
normal.
normal?
Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
it's normal because we had a victim come to us that didn't say anything about David Hamlin. And the only reason I even mentioned David Hamlin is because he's in jail. Well, he's going through the court process on two cases that we helped process to get him be prosecuted on it. So, but what happens? This person comes to us in April of 2021, and over the next year, a little more than a year, as we're investigating this, and this is normal as we do this. You get a case and it starts right in one spot, and as you're going along, all of a sudden you have something that branches off over here, or something that branches
Sure.
off over here, and so you have to follow those directions that it takes you. Maybe a new witness comes forward, or maybe the original person tells you about somebody that they talked to, and you go talk to that person and they send you off in another direction. Well, eventually, during the course of that investigation, we became aware of the investigation that Provo Police Department had with David Hamlin, but we still, at that point, didn't have anything to make a case against him. But as we moved forward, it developed so that we did, and we had victims two different victims who did not know each other.
Oh, so they weren't his daughters. They were two
No,
victims that weren't his
they
daughters.
they were different people than the original victim that got us started in April of 2021. And so,
was the original victim in 2021, was that his daughter? Or
I can't comment on that.
Okay.
Honestly,
Okay. All right.
I wouldn't be able to comment on it, but I honestly don't know who the victim is.
Okay. Okay.
Whether it's somebody he knows or not, or if it wasn't even David Hamlin that was the focus of our investigation in April
Oh,
of
I see.
2021.
Okay.
So
Okay.
as it moved forward, then we became aware of that case, and as we became aware of that, then we developed enough information to be able to have two separate cases where we could charge David Hamlin and eventually his now ex-wife, Rosie. Don't remember her
Roselle.
last name that she's going by now,
Okay.
but yeah, so that we did not even, I don't know if we even knew who they were when we started our case in April of 2021, but we became aware of them. And then it became to the point where David first was a focus of our investigation, and then Rosie.
Okay. Okay. So can I ask, and I don't know, so both of them are facing criminal prosecution?
That is correct.
Is that?
But currently
And
one case against Rosie and two against David. We arrested David Hamlin in September of 2022. He was in jail till about March of this year and was released on bail, and he has some conditions for his release, electronic monitoring, I believe, and that kind of stuff. We arrested Roselle Stevenson in August of this year, and she was in jail for about 3 weeks and was released on bail. So they both they're not married anymore, but they both have cases pending in court. One of those for David Hamlin is here in Utah County. The other one is down in San Pete County, and Roselle's case is here in Utah County.
okay. Okay. So I'll ask about the prosecution of them in a little bit more, but I want to know, so did you, as a result of doing their case, did you read the Hamlin daughters' victim statements, or not victim statements, their affidavits, whatever they brought forward?
Are you talking about
And
one that was involved with the case from 10 or 12 years ago, the 115-page
well,
statement?
I'm trying to understand how David Leavitt got involved.
What I can
Was that
tell you,
related to
the
this?
only
Okay.
reason I can say anything about that is because that document has been released publicly. There was a statement, it's about 115 pages long that was involved in the investigation that Provo Police Department did. There were local media here who, through a public records request, obtained that document, and that did come into our hands, it's been made known and it's publicly available. David Leavitt's name is in there. I can't speak to the specifics because I haven't read the entire thing. I've read parts of it, but I haven't read the whole thing. But yeah, that's where his name kind of came into it. But as far as whether there's any investigation with him or not, I can't say.
Okay. And so my understanding is he just kind of held this bizarre press conference because he found out that his name was in that. And then now he's in Scotland. Am I pretty much caught? He's in a castle in Scotland.
That's a real nutshell version of it. Yeah. We put our press release out on May 31st of 2022, looking to encourage people who may have been victimized in a ritualistic kind of way to come forward and talk to us. And we had a lot of people that did. It was the next day on June 1st of 2022 that David Leavitt held a press conference around noon, the middle of the day or so. And he declared that he was not a cannibal, that he was not a bunch of things. It's out there. People can Google search it if they want to watch it. It's pretty unusual. I've been involved in public relations with the sheriff's office for a long time. I know a lot of local media, and I had some of them saying, "Man, that's the most bizarre press conference I've ever been to." I would not disagree with them. I watched it, and it was unusual. But in that, he accused a number of people, myself and Sheriff Smith included, of having political motives. And I don't have a political bone in my body.
I can attest to that.
When it comes
I know you.
to those kinds of things, yes, I am active. I've been a delegate. I try to vote regularly and everything. But my motivation in doing anything when it comes to police work is to protect innocent victims. And that is the only motivation we had in putting out the press release we did on May 31st. Anybody, including David Leavitt, who said anything otherwise about why we did that is up in the night. They don't know what they're talking about.
Or they're hiding something.
They can search my phones, they can search my computers, and it will be the most boring couple of hours they've had in a long time. If they need some help getting to sleep, look through my phones. They're pretty boring.
Okay, so he immediately you said, if there are victims, we're ready to, go ahead and call this hotline.
Yes.
The very next day, he did this press briefing, press conference.
Yeah.
Not like saying I'm not a cannibal, and also it's Spencer Smith and Spencer Cannon and Mike Smith are bad guys and they're just coming after me.
Right. He called for resignations and investigations into us and into the sheriff's office about who released that document, when all he would have had to do is call Provo Police Department and say, "Who did you give this document to?" And he would have found out, and it never would have done anything. The Utah County Commission got on board initially and initiated an investigation, and I think their investigation lasted all of a day or two because they then found out where the document came from and that it was not from us.
Wow. Okay. Do you have any do you have any speculation of why he did it? Because it makes him guilty as sin, first of all, but it also brings up what was he doing? It makes it, to me, it gives some credibility to this whole Church of Satan stuff.
No, I don't. I try to avoid that. We deal in law enforcement. We try to deal with facts and elements of crimes. And for me to say anything about why he chose to do that would be just speculation because I don't know exactly why he did. But what I do know is that nobody at the sheriff's office released anything to the media or anybody in the public. And we did not have political motives. Those are two things I can say. But for me to say anything about what his motives are in doing that, it would be speculation. And I try to avoid that if I can.
Okay. That's great. I won't make you speculate, but you did say, but you can say it was the weirdest thing ever.
It was unusual. It was very unusual. I've called a lot of press briefings myself for media. I've coordinated them for other people to lead them. I've led them myself. I've attended other press briefings, and I do have to admit that that was one of the more unusual ones I've ever seen.
Okay. All right. So I have a couple other questions. So for you, you just look at the crime, which is sexual abuse, child abuse. So you don't get into, even like you said, the ritualistic necessarily, and definitely, and probably not like the satanic element, the Church of Satan things. That's not part of your investigation
No, no. In
necessarily.
this one, I think I could say that satanic wasn't a part of it, but ritualistic was a part of it. Just a small example of that. In one of the press releases I did about the David Hamlin arrest, I believe it was the first arrest we made, uh, included fact that it was told to us by a victim that part of the process of the abuse included religious blessings given to the victim by David Hamlin. Um, if that doesn't make something at least somewhat ritualistic in nature, I don't know what does. But
Hmm.
so that kind of
Okay.
thing. But satanic, I wouldn't say that satanic was a core property of these ritualistic sexual abuse cases that we're looking at, but it can be an element of it. But we purposely characterize it as ritualistic child sexual abuse, not describing the nature or the content of those. Whether we didn't use the word satanic, uh, mainly because we that wasn't part of what the allegations were, but ritualistic was part of what the circumstances included.
Okay. Okay. So I want to talk about a couple of other things. So interestingly, so with the Hamlin daughters' testimonies, something that comes up is polygamy. And so that's something I've been kind of looking into is the strange and uncomfortable and upsetting connections between polygamy and this ritualistic abuse. I mean, first of all, I think that my understanding is, and I don't want to, say it's everyone or do broad accusations,
No.
but polygamy groups tend to have a lot of problems with sexual abuse. And oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, we don't, I don't, and we at the sheriff's office don't have a lot of experience with those kinds of cases. I think we, like most other people, what we see are the things that you see with Warren Jeffs, uh, and polygamy in that kind of a setting clearly is problematic. When you have people being forced into marriage. At very very young ages. That seems very problematic. And from what I saw in the news, and again, my expertise on that is not even expertise; it's just knowledge from what I've seen in news reports and things. I haven't even read police reports on it, but those were very unusual. The One of the purposes is getting married, getting these wives, and it seems, and that just doesn't seem right in its approach and how those are done. And there were some people I think that were treated very badly. And it may be that when you see those kinds of cases of abuse, maybe they are more surrounded with plural marriage kinds of settings. But I think that's probably not a fair way to characterize many people who are involved in that. While it might not be something I ever have any interest in doing, some people are. And, from a law enforcement perspective, if people are involved in that and they're treating each other well and they're not abusing their children, I'm not even aware of us at the Utah County Sheriff's Office. At least I have never been involved in a plural marriage or polygamy, bigamy investigation. If they're leaving each other alone, treating each other well, and not living off of the public dole, you know.
So it's just the
I,
other crimes.
I can't say that I advocate for making it 100% legal, but I can say, I mean, we're not out there looking for people, and I know there are places, at least a couple of them in Utah County, where plural marriage goes on. The only time I've
Oh,
ever
for
gone,
sure.
yeah, the only place there's one up, well, it's in a part of the county that I've been to a couple of times, but it was on medical calls. They live a very private life. They were nervous about letting us in, but honestly, we were there because in one case, was having a diabetic problem, and they did the right thing by calling. And all I cared about was
Was helping.
facilitating the ambulance and the paramedics getting in there to help these people. I couldn't have cared less how they were living.
Okay. Okay. I appreciate that. I think I'm trying to navigate this because I started out being very sympathetic to polygamous people who had these beliefs. I wanted to share the investigations I've done in the scripture of why I think that it was a mistake from the beginning. It was never of God. That's what
Mhm.
I started out doing. But as I've studied it more, I've seen more and more and more the actual malignancy of these ideas. And so there are people who are generally peaceful. And, I think I think it still creates a lot of suffering that's unnecessary. I think it is just an idea designed to create misery and suffering. So, at its best. But I've seen more and more things that are deeply problematic. Like, for example, in these Hamblin girl testimonies, they talk about some of the human sacrifices would be like little boys from polygamist groups because there's no record of them and no one knows, and they need to get rid of little boys. Or I think there was a little girl that had maybe a hair lip or some other, there's probably a better term I'm supposed to use nowadays, but some sort of a facial deformity, so I guess I'm just, and I've talked to some people that are advocates for people trying to escape polygamy, because that's often what it is. It's a prison of the mind as much as anything else, but sometimes it's actually a physical prison. So I guess I am kind of struggling with the whole decriminalization
Yeah,
movement.
yeah.
I think it's
It's there's so many things that if you look at some of the things in society with definitions of marriage and even definitions of who people are and gender and all those things. From my perspective in law enforcement, I can have my personal views on something, but I have to be able to separate those. When I get a call
sure.
of either somebody having trouble or somebody being suicidal or somebody having been a victim of a crime or somebody having been involved in a crash, I can't go there and look at them and let my personal views come into how I treat them. I have to treat them with complete decency and respect, and help them through whatever situation they're in. If I ever have a circumstance where my personal views come in, and I have had conversations with people when I've been working that the conversation is personal in nature, but that's in a situation, it doesn't happen very often, but maybe I take someone to jail and they have something in common with one of my children that is having some troubles in a certain area, or maybe a child or a teenager has died in an accident and I'm talking to the parents. And for me to be just regimented in my law enforcement,
Robotic. Yeah.
I don't believe that's the right thing to do. If I can show them some compassion and some caring in what is maybe the worst moment of their life, it's not something that is necessarily described in my job description, but it is something that is the right thing to do. I'll give you an example. Sheriff Smith is the current elected sheriff, and I've been a number of times in situations where he has done swearing in ceremonies for new deputies that are just hiring on with the sheriff's office. He gives them a little speech and he says to them, the law gives you the right to take away people's freedom in certain circumstances, but the law never gives you the right to no, he says, the law never, ever, ever gives you the right to take away someone's dignity.
I
And
love
so
it. Okay.
when we work with people, no matter what their life circumstance is or whatever their life circumstance is, we try to treat them with respect and afford them the dignity that they deserve. Now, as far as plural marriage goes, like I say, we have not, that I'm aware of, ever dealt with. I know I have never dealt with a case like that, other than a couple of times, handful of times that I've mentioned, where there was a medical problem and we were there to assist medical people That's the only interactions that I've had with them from a law enforcement perspective. Um, and I didn't ever sense anything in either one of those settings where there was somebody being mistreated or anything like that. So I'm not 100% sure where I stand on this. I know where I stand on it legally. There are
Sure.
laws, whether people like it or not, that we don't make any effort to enforce. Um, you know, I'll give from a traffic perspective, if somebody has their gas cap that's not completely connected, that's actually against the law. I've never stopped
Okay.
anybody and enforced that, and I don't plan on it. Um, so if somebody is living in a plural marriage style, even and it's only an infraction now for basic level living in polygamy. There are other circumstances where it can be either a third or a second degree felony. But if somebody's living in a circumstance like that, from a law enforcement perspective, I'm not even going to give it a second look.
Okay.
If there is somebody being harmed, yeah, we'll take a look at it and we'll take it as far as we need to. It may be that all we can do is um, cite them with an infraction, which is if I write somebody a speeding ticket, that's an infraction. That's what basic level bigamy in Utah is an infraction now. If there is fraud involved in it, or if there is abuse involved in it, if there is coercion involved in it, then it can become either a third degree or a second degree felony. Second being more serious. But if it's anything lower than that,
Okay.
yeah, we have more important things to work on.
Yeah, yeah, sure. And see, and okay, I appreciate this. Like, it's such a complicated conversation
Oh, it
because
is. It is. Yeah.
yeah, like my homeschool mom of a big family self loves hearing, the last thing I want is more government intrusion into homes and families, right? Like, and
Yeah.
then at the same time, I guess, sort of, as I've talked to people who are so aware of the human trafficking happening and the things with, like, we have Samuel Bateman and what are some of the other prophets that have come up and these revelations, and we have people's kids being kidnapped and taken, right? And I mean, just horrible, horrible things. And it seems like there's no ability to help.
Yeah.
The polygamists, from what I understand, kind of work with each other and kind of have this underground network of even hiding people's children.
Yeah.
And
There may be some of that, and those are the kinds of things that, well, and you have to look too. Um, there are things that are reprehensible behavior, but not illegal, and then there are things that are clearly illegal. For example, if I'm in the store and I see a 5-year-old kid reach up for a candy bar and say, "Mom, can I have this?" and the mom berates the child and tells them how stupid they are. We can't
sure.
afford that. You know, I want to smack her, but she's not breaking the law. She might be a bad parent, but she's not breaking the law. Now, if that child grabs for that candy bar and says, "Mom, can I have that?" and she slaps the kid across the face and knocks him onto the floor, she's going in handcuffs because we
Hmm.
can do something about that. Um, if you have these other things, if I think a lot of it we have to be able to separate too. What is just bad parenting and choice of lifestyle that isn't causing I don't know, isn't causing damaging harm to somebody,
Or at least isn't breaking the law. Yeah.
isn't breaking the law. That's probably the best way to put it, versus what we think is teaching bad principles. There's plenty of examples of people who have broken away from some of these groups that have been damaging to them. And I've read a couple of books about them, and they are disturbing. But it goes beyond just having a different religious approach to living, which might include plural marriage. And there's more to it than just that. There is moving from state to state or even country to country and house to house to hide what's going on. And yeah, it's scary when it gets to those points when they're making an effort to blur the lines of where a family is or where they live and what they do. You have to at least wonder, is there something else going on there? But again, we have to have evidence. I've had a lot of situations in my career with other things, not with polygamy, but with other things where I knew a crime had been committed, but I didn't have evidence to prove it. And we have to have evidence to prove it. to make an arrest, we have to have probable cause. To get a conviction, you have to have beyond a reasonable doubt, and that's a high standard to try to meet.
Sure, sure. So I guess that's my question, is because it seems to me, and from what I have heard and understand, is that it's harder to get evidence when, I guess, decriminalizing polygamy, where we know already that secrecy is a huge part of it, even if it's not being prosecuted. There's massive secrecy, right? And a lot of that is also hiding clear crimes, but it's really hard to get the evidence because plural marriage itself can't be the evidence, right? And so all of the like child labor that is absolutely a part of it, the educational what's the word, neglect, right? Like and these are, like I said, I'm so torn on this because I like I like parental autonomy without the government, but I also don't want these things to happen. And then what we do know of several cases of abductions. And so I guess I'm just wondering, from your perspective, has decriminalizing polygamy made it harder to help people that are being abused in the system and harder to prosecute what might be actual crimes?
Well, I think the polygamy itself hasn't typically been the problem. The underlying problem is when there's abuse going on, is when children are being harmed, when they are being secreted away to different locations for the purpose of keeping them from telling anybody, or keeping, say,
Keeping them
child
hidden,
welfare
yeah.
officials or law enforcement from getting to them and having a conversation with them. They want to control that part of it. Then that becomes problematic. And the way that happens certainly creates an environment that makes it more difficult for law enforcement to follow up on those things. I say at a basic level, the infraction level polygamy we couldn't care less about. What we do care a great deal about is just exactly what you're talking about, the things that happen if there is abuse going on, either child labor problems or sexual abuse or marriage,
Underage marriages,
or whatever it might be. If those things are happening and those victims are being moved to places to hide that, that is a problem. And if we have evidence to prove that those things are happening, we'll go after them just as hard as we will otherwise. But as I'm sure you know, these kinds of networks, to get into them and get any one of those people to talk to you is extremely challenging. And to get hold of a victim or a potential victim, or even suspicion that there is a victim, is really, really hard to do because they are such a tight and closed network. Now, I think being a closed group like that isn't in itself enough to say that
sure.
we need to make this change, because there's got to be some out there that are completely harmless. They're living a normal life. They're good to each other, whether they have 2 or 3 spouses or whatever. I'm sure there are some that are living a decent life, that aren't harming those
that are benign. Yeah.
who love. They're supporting their families well, and each other emotionally and financially and all those things, educationally, whatever. But it's particularly worrisome when we know that there are others out there that are not that way, that are problematic, where abuse does happen. And if they're being moved around to hide that, we know. I mean, with Warren Jeffs is a perfect example of that, how deep those dark networks can go in trying to, 1, hide the abuse, and then 2, hide the abusers.
Yes. Okay. So let me get my thoughts in order. But one thing, I guess I'll go here first, is that it's so hard because it's such a part of our heritage. And I've been studying the history, and I just came across another story. I come across them all the time, of a little 14-year-old girl with very poor parents. She was the oldest of 8 children in Scotland. Her father was blind, and they shipped her on the Perpetual Immigration Fund, I believe, and she turned 15 on her way here, came, without her parents. And within 2 months of being in Utah, was married off to a 49-year-old.
That's
and
tough.
So it's tough. And it's, this is my great grandmother's story. This is day after day after day. This is our heritage, right? And again, it was secluded, isolated, complete control. So it's really hard because there tends to be this like softening of it, where sociologically it's really been proven that there are no benefits of polygamy. Always the marriage ages of the girls get younger and younger. The boys get, you have to get rid of the boys. I'm not even touching on the problems that there are with this, but it's always problematic. So it's even hard. Like, yes, there are wonderful people and there are benign families, but in general, as a rule, it's not good. And there are no good fruits of it. And so, I think I guess what I kind of want to get to is like the Warren Jeffs case when what was it? Was it the Texas
Yeah.
police force? I guess, the word invaded is coming to mind, but that's not the right word. But when they went into the Yearning for Zion ranch and did that. And like, I remember I totally fell for the show that the polygamists put on, feeling like these poor people. I was much, much more sympathetic to it at that point.
Yeah.
But now I look at it and I'm like, it is such a dang good thing that they did that.
Yeah.
Right. I think and we wouldn't know that. We would just think, oh, they're benign. It's a good thing that Warren Jeffs had the technology to have recording devices. And it's a good thing that they did that so they could get those, or we would have no idea. And so we don't know what happened in our past, and we don't know what's happening elsewhere because it's just secret and no one's done the horrible thing that the Texas, that was a horrible thing to have to do.
Oh, it was, yeah.
But I think generally we're glad that they did it. Like, we think it's a good thing. Right. And so.
Oh, I completely agree. It's a good thing that they did it. I don't know. I would assume, I'm quite certain that before they went into the compound,
they had a phone call.
Wherever they had a phone call, they had somebody sneak into their office or something. They had something that got them to the point where they could start getting search warrants and things like that. While I love our legal system, there are some aspects of it that are really that I wish could be different, but because I am such a strong believer in it, it has to be that way. And even if something's going on, if I can't get it the right way, it's hard to stand back, but It's really what we have to do to preserve the integrity of our legal system,
Which is exactly right. So this is my question that just is coming to me as we're talking. So when we have these big criminal networks, what usually happens, at least, as someone who grew up watching TV, so,
yeah.
But we go, like we go undercover. Right? Like you go undercover. You don't wait for someone to call and turn in a drug dealer you go undercover to get at the crime that's happening. And I would say we have definitely plenty of suspicion, reason of evidence to point to crimes. So why can't we do things like going undercover into some of like the Kingstons? My goodness. There's so much.
Yeah.
I mean, like at the very least, the baby graveyards because of all the inbreeding and and then we have these allegations of like polygamous children being given to for a ritual sacrifice, like all of these kinds of things. Yeah. Couldn't we do an undercover investigation?
Yeah, and on the face of it, you can. Going undercover in any network can be very, very challenging. For the narcotics world, for example, it's a little bit easier to do because all you got to do is pretend like you either buying dope or you are working your way up the chain. If you get deep enough, you can even get in with the cartel, at the cartel level and things. Something like this would be, I think, a lot more challenging because they are such a closed society, and it could be very difficult to do, to work your way in to the extent that you can find out exactly what's happening beyond just speculation.
Female cops could do it.
Yeah. Anyway, so it would be nice to get in. That is no doubt one of the most challenging aspects of investigating these kinds of things, is how do you get in to the inside? How do you gain their trust? And also you have to have something that can lead you into doing that. You can't just go with drug dealing, for example. If I know where to go to buy drugs, I can go there and I can act like I'm somebody who wants to buy some. And if somebody approaches me, then I've done my job by just acting like I want some. Or I can even approach somebody and say, "Hey, I've got some drugs to sell, or do you have any drugs you can sell me?" Um, but with something like this, uh, you, it would be hard and maybe not even ethical to try to insert yourself into a situation where you don't have any evidence to suggest that something is going badly, that there's abuse going on, or whatever it might be, child labor, whatever. Um, it might not even be ethical to try to do that if you don't have some evidence to. Well, I know it would be unethical from a law enforcement perspective to try to do that where you
Sure.
have zero suspicion even that something like that is going on. Beyond just saying, okay, if you throw a broad blanket over it and say polygamous families in general tend to do these things, that's not enough really to go into this particular
Yeah.
polygamous family and start trying to do it. Imagine, I mean, the most public thing that see now is Cody Brown and the sister wives. Imagine trying to work your way into that group undercover. And I'm not suggesting that they are breaking laws or committing abuse. I have no reason to believe that. I'm just, for instance, if I wanted to go in there just to see, how would I do that?
Yeah.
He might take on
Yeah. I
another
guess, I
wife.
guess
He's not going to take on another husband.
For
So,
sure. But that's what I'm asking. Like, in a way, if we don't have any suspicion, it seems like it's because we're not looking, because we're closing a blind eye to it. Because you could very easily find work sites with 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old boys. That's something that would be seeable if
yeah,
we didn't just look away. We can see the young women, right, that are mothers that shouldn't be. We can see, I mean, there are so many things. And then even like the bleeding the beast, the signing up for benefits. Those are things that we're turning a blind eye to time
yeah.
and time and time again. And then even things like the women that have left and their children are being taken from them and they can't get their children. That would be a fantastic reason. So I don't want it to be this broad brush. It seems like, okay, if there's a woman who's saying my children are missing, that's a pretty big deal.
Well,
And
it
it
would be,
feels to me
but
like
we
we
have to
kind of
have
turn a
them.
blind eye.
Yeah, but we have to have them come to us and tell us that in the first place, and
Okay.
I think a lot of it is getting them to the point where they have the courage. Maybe they fear that if they come and report something that they will go deeper into hiding and be that much more difficult to find. And we know that that from some groups who have been particularly problematic, that they have a good ability to go deep into hiding or keep outsiders from getting in. So we have to have some information that is happening. As far as looking at, say, welfare records and things like that, I suppose that could happen. I don't know if maybe it has, and I don't know. I honestly don't know because I've never been involved in one of the investigations to know. I've been involved in other investigations. So if I, for example, suspect that I have reason to believe, probable cause to believe that somebody is uh, abusing prescriptions, then I may be able to get a warrant to search their Doppel records to see their prescription history, and that may then tell me something and open it up. But it also may get me in there and say, oh, well, I guess they're really not. If they're misusing prescription drugs, they're getting it from somewhere else, but not from doctors. So in a case like this, if somebody is misusing public welfare resources, or they're abusing child labor laws, or you've got underage girls having babies, uh, yeah, we have to look. If I see a girl who looks like she's 14 years old with a brand new newborn baby walking across the parking lot at Costco in St. George, that alone isn't enough to tell me even that baby
It's
she's the
hers.
mother of that child. So we
Right.
have to be careful about, it's we have to be careful we don't trample on people's rights in doing that. Their
Absolutely.
constitutional protections, search and seizure, and all those kinds of things. So we really have to be careful. And some circumstances are much more difficult to get that. There may be criminal activity going on that we can't get to because we don't have enough information even to start an investigation, let alone get a warrant or arrest anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's, I guess, what I'm wondering is if it's possible to make it a little bit higher of a priority. what would need to happen, because I do feel like there's a lot of evidence there for the getting, like the way that you put out the press report saying, hey, if anyone has any information on ritualistic abuse, is there a way to say, hey, if there are problems that someone has experienced of any of this nature, you know what I mean? I don't know if there's a way to prioritize it when we know that, I mean, from what I've understood, just a couple of statistics from some of the advocates I've been speaking to, the rates of suicide in polygamous groups are exponentially higher than just the regular population.
Yeah.
What?
No,
that's not illegal, but it's kind of showing the level of.
No, that's an indicator of problems in some way or another. I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when we know that really, like, human trafficking, especially when you're talking about taking work crews across state lines, but like those are major crimes when you're taking girls to different locations to be married. And we have every indication that these things have always been happening and are continuing to happen. And so what can we do to help this become a higher priority so that we can help these people?
I think some of it depends on the area where it is, getting the information. Maybe there is more that could be done proactively, educating officials with authority there, whether it's family services officials or law enforcement. Somebody writing up a document that says, okay, this is the information that I have that makes me believe that this is going on here. Whether that can do something for it or not, I don't know. But we certainly want to address issues where there are problems, and whether or not having polygamy at a infraction level, at the basic level of polygamy in Utah, is a good idea or not. The other problematic behaviors have always been the same level. So if somebody is being married off at age 13, can't do that. That's not okay, or 12 or 11 or whatever, that's not okay. Whether polygamy is an infraction or a first degree felony, there are certain behaviors and acts that are never, I hope never, going to be okay, that are wrong, whether polygamy is an infraction or a felony.
Whatever the context is.
Educating us, we'll take education. We're not so high on ourselves to think that we know everything there is to know. If there's something going on that is more serious than we understand it to be, or maybe we're misguided in believing that it isn't that big of a problem, we certainly want to know about it. I mean, my wife is a fan of the Sister Wives show, and they're falling apart. Their family's falling apart. I think there's no doubt about that. And it's sad to see, but I think we need to be careful to not rush to judgment and say that they're falling apart because they're living a polygamous lifestyle. The fact is, regular marriages are falling apart at a rate of probably in the neighborhood of 50% or more nationwide. So is it because of the lifestyle they live? Maybe. Is it because they're just going through the normal vicissitudes of life and marriage? That might be it too. So,
sure.
If there are things out there that are bad that are going on that could have something done about them, if we did more about it, we got to have enough information to steer us in that direction too.
Okay. I love you, Spencer. I love that you're just so humble and saying we're willing to learn. I have so many thoughts of what you just said, because as someone who has spent many years interacting on this topic, and I often engage with, when I initially started my Facebook group on this topic, when I suddenly realized that polygamy was never of God, and I had a lot of polygamous men come and join the group and tell me their biggest insult for me when they realized that they couldn't convince me was, I would never want you as a wife. I don't know anyone who would want to be married to you. Isn't that funny? That's like the worst insult in the polygamy world that you can give a woman, is that she's not desirable.
A man who's got 3 or 4 wives already wouldn't want you as a wife. Yeah.
Right, right. It was amusing. But a lot of the things you're saying are things they would say, like, well, monogamy too, like they have their problems too. And it's
Yeah.
so like, and like, yes, that's true, but we haven't done the sociological, well, they were done in Canada. Canada looked at the sociological studies of what this actually does and decided to make it completely illegal. Like we have done polygamy is problematic. It is
Here's
much, much worse
here's
than
I
monogamy.
think I
But
think a way we need to look at it too is, um, let's assume if there is something about polygamy itself that creates problems or creates abuse or whatever you want to say that would not occur but for polygamy, then clearly we would need to address that and do something about it. Now, uh, when I say creates
or at
problems
least,
that would not
can
happen,
I
I mean,
say at least,
yeah, if a guy's got
sorry.
four wives and he gets in an argument with all four of them, if he didn't have four wives, he'd only have one wife to get in an argument with. Uh, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, abuse or child welfare, child labor kinds of issues, or welfare fraud. Uh, yes, those things happen in monogamy, but if they happen at a greater level or unique to polygamy, then yeah, we need to address those issues. Should be addressed.
Okay, okay. So, and then I have, this is my other question. I feel like there is a tendency for us, maybe particularly as members of the church and in Utah, to really feel somewhat protective of polygamy because it's our heritage. And we still, I'm serious, like we still have Section 132. Many people still believe it's in our future. Many still believe it's a true doctrine. And so we're hesitant to be willing to, like I said, the stories that are in our heritage could make us think, oh, well, Brigham Young did it, so it can't be that bad. If they're marrying 14-year-olds, that's just what they do. I
Yeah.
mean, I feel like there is this tendency, and that is where I think it might be useful to provide some degree of training or education to help
Yeah.
people understand.
Well, I can tell you this from a law enforcement perspective. Um, I couldn't care less what history is in the LDS church or any religion. If there are laws that are violated that are particularly harmful to anybody, we're going to go after them. I mean, and I'm a fairly black and white kind of a guy, and the law is the law. Now that being said, I already mentioned earlier there are some things that we just don't pay any attention to, traffic laws or whatever, but
Mhm.
if there is something specific in polygamy that is creating harm. People are being harmed in a criminal way, in some way, either society through welfare fraud or child labor laws or child sexual abuse that is couched in the form of marriages, whatever it might be. If those are problems there and if they exist and they're happening, which we know to some extent they do, then we need to address those. And if there are aspects of it that are, we need to be able to separate that from the aspects of it that are just maybe distasteful to us. But
Sure, just a
you like
different
you
lifestyle.
like living that way, but I don't. So have at it. But if there are people being harmed criminally, either through sexual abuse or child labor laws or welfare fraud, that kind of thing, yeah, we need to find a way to address those things if we can. But there are certain elements of those kinds of groups that are particularly difficult to get into and find all that. And we know that with the Warren Jeffs thing. I was not part of that investigation, but just from what I did see, I remember watching news reports on that and thinking that must have been a nightmare to try to get inside of that and to get that information, because they were so protective of each other for so long, many of them.
Right, right. Okay. Okay. So I guess that's my plea is like, first of all, if there are people who have evidence or who have evidence of crime or who have suffered in these systems, either the ritualistic abuse or some of the problems that come up because of polygamy, obviously, like I like what you're saying, not just the lifestyle is a lifestyle, but the problems within it.
Yeah.
I hope that people will start reporting more. And just like I loved everything you said about we believe the victims, we prioritize this, you matter, you put out the press
Yeah.
release. I'm wanting that same amount of care and attention to be available to people who have experienced abuse in polygamy, to know that they can come forward and that
Yeah.
it will be taken seriously and prioritized.
Yeah. And it's interesting. And a lot of times people don't know where to call, and they worry, should I call the non-emergency number or should I call 911? If you don't know, just call 911. If somebody sees this and they're in one of those situations, if their parents are living in plural marriage and it's otherwise fine, you might just have to live with it. But if somebody is suffering abuse uh, in one of those kinds of settings, yeah, call police, call law enforcement, call 911. If you don't know what number to call, everybody knows 911, and it's okay to do that. And let law enforcement look into it. Wherever you are, if you're suffering abuse at the hands of somebody, whether you're in and we're talking specifically about plural relationships here, plural marriage relationships. But in any situation, if you're in a situation where you feel trapped, you feel like you don't have any way to go, any place to go, there are people out there in law enforcement, in child protective services, in prosecution, in judges, in therapists, in medical people, doctors and nurses who want to help people who have been abused. And in this context as well, if somebody happens to see this and they have been a victim of abuse, absolutely. We encourage people, tell a trusted adult. Well, in a setting like that, you might not have a trusted adult. And if you
Mm-hmm.
don't, find a way that you can get to a phone and call 911 or whatever. We want to help you. We want to believe people. We want to get people resources and services that they need so that they can feel safe. They can go to bed at night without worrying who's going to crawl in with them or anything like that. That they can be perfectly safe and perfectly happy in their life, even in an imperfect life, but in a life that includes abuse of any kind or child welfare or child labor violations or anything like that. Call 911. If you don't know the number to call, just call 911.
Okay. That's excellent. And I'll just put out there, because I know there's also the fear of, if people call and it's not able to be proven, or there's not enough evidence, and then they're just sent back home, their situation could be infinitely worse. So that's a scary thing for some people as well. So if there's anyone that's feeling, go ahead.
It is worrisome, and that does sometimes happen. If somebody comes to us having experienced something, and we can't gather enough evidence, either in terms of statements or physical evidence, then yeah, sometimes we aren't able to prove the cases that we know happened, but we just don't have the evidence to prove it. And that is, we try not to let that happen. We try to step in and with welfare checks and things, but we want people to come forward and know that they'll be taken seriously.
That's excellent. And so I just also want to say, go ahead and email me. My email is 132problems@gmail.com. And I can help. I know Spencer. I can ask him what direction to go and what would be the most helpful thing there are. I can also lead you to people who can be a safe house for anyone who just needs to get away from whatever situation they're in. And I was going to let you wrap up. Oh, go ahead. And then I'll ask my last question. Did you have something you wanted to say?
No, just I like that. It's important to get official services involved and things like that. As much as we want to take the poor child in and protect them, we have to not become part of the problem too. If a child comes to us and says, "My dad's abusing me," or "He's mean to me," or "He spanks me," it's not against the law to spank a child, but whatever. If a child comes to us and says, "I just don't feel safe at home," we can't just keep them in our home to protect them. We have to get law
Sure.
enforcement involved, because if we don't, then we may put ourselves at risk of facing investigation as well. And the ultimate focus is to protect that child. And if we can prove that they're in a dangerous situation, we'll do everything we can to keep them out of that.
That's perfect. I was trying to offer to be an intermediary for someone who doesn't quite dare call the police, right? They can
Yeah.
contact me and I can find out how much
Oh,
information
yeah.
they need. And, like I think that there are lots of us who would like to be someone's trusted adult who doesn't feel like they have one,
Yeah.
right? That's I guess what
Well,
I'm saying. Like we'll be happy to be your trusted
yeah.
adult or your
It,
trusted
it, and
source.
it may be a situation where a child isn't in a setting where they are suffering abuse or where they are being forced into child labor situations or something. It may be just that their parents aren't very nice.
Yeah.
And if you can provide a safe setting for them for a few hours, 2 or 3 days a week, you know, maybe that's what we can do. Uh, and obviously, if it gets worse than that and those other things are happening and they tell us about it, we can also pick up the phone and call 911. That's the easiest thing to do.
Okay, that's perfect. And so now, because you said something that made me think of another question when I was going to let you go. So you had mentioned doing welfare checks, and I guess I'm curious about this problem of like there not being any record of births. And again, I'm such a small government libertarian type person that but at the same time, when these babies can just disappear and people can just disappear because there's no record of them, that's concerning. And when we have allegations that has happened, you know, is
Uh-huh.
there a way to just do welfare checks and make sure there's at least a birth certificate for babies that are born?
If again, I use the example of a very young looking girl walking across the parking lot of Costco in St. George, um, I can't just walk up and say, show me this child's birth certificate. It's not
Papers,
how we work
please.
in
Yeah.
America. So it's hard to do. Now, if we have solid information to suggest that that might be the case, maybe there is more we can do, but we can't just, you know, I mean, in Russia, you can walk up to every person and demand their papers. Can't do that here in America without cause.
Yeah, thank heaven. But I guess so. So these Hamlin girls' testimonies that talk about these horrific human sacrifices, and they mention Indian reservations and Native American children or polygamous children because there's no record of them. That's not enough evidence to say,
Well, you
are
have to
you,
you
are
have to have a
you
reason. You have to have a reason to believe that there's no
specific?
record, a reason to investigate that. Uh, and I don't know. I don't even know honestly if it's illegal to be born and not have a birth certificate. The state. It's not something I've ever dealt with, but
Okay.
when they get to a certain age, obviously there has to be a record of them. You're supposed to have a social security number and all that kind of stuff. But it's a
Okay.
challenging thing. Yeah.
So I guess my hope is that people can kind of put their heads together and figure out better ways not to persecute people. That's not the goal, but to protect people
Yes.
from this bad system
Yeah.
that are suffering in it. So that's my hope, is that we can all work together as a society and a community, and as the trusted adults, the responsible people,
Yeah.
to help
Yeah.
people
For
that are
real.
suffering in these systems. So
Yeah.
Spencer, thank you so much for
Yeah. It's
taking
good
this
to
time to
talk to
talk to
you.
me. Is there anything else you want to say before I
No,
wrap
no.
up?
I've about spilled my guts on you here. Yeah. So,
Well, I sure appreciate it. So thank you, and I'll talk to you soon.
okay. Good to talk to you.
Another huge thank you to Spencer for giving me so much of his time and being willing to talk to me. That was a really fun interview to do. I hope that you found it valuable. I promise in the next episodes, I will give you plenty of warning for anything that will be difficult to listen to, because the next interview will be more difficult than this one was. But my hope is that all of us can become more aware of the things that are happening around us, so that we can do more to help in whatever way we feel called to. I was really happy to be able to talk about some different ways that maybe law enforcement could become more aware of some of the problems, and maybe there's some work that can be done there. I'm thinking that maybe some advocacy could be done to help educate police officers and help facilitate that work being done in more effective and better ways, so that we can help more people. And so anyway, feel free to contact me if there's anything I can do to help you in a situation you may be in, or if you have any great ideas and we can put some coalitions together. I don't know, I'm not a great organizer, but I want to do whatever I can to help. So thank you so much, and I will see you next time.